Picture this. It is March 1943, and Lieutenant James Howard peers through frost-rimed plexiglass from the nose of his B-17, 23,000 feet above occupied France, watching a world of tiny fields and tiny houses scroll beneath like a model railroad while the real, terrible arithmetic of strategic bombing is being written in steel and fire. 8 hours earlier, his crew had climbed into an aluminum coffin, wrapped themselves in heated suits and oxygen masks, and taken off into a sky that would not forgive error. And now, after hours of altitude, cold. Evasive maneuvers and bursts of tracer light from Messerschmitts that come so quickly they are almost a sound. His bombardier calls, "Bombs away!" with the brittle confidence that comes from habit and training. And for a stinging 30 seconds, Howard watches through his binoculars as 12 500-pound bombs peel away from the belly of their airplane and hang like clumsy, helpless promises against the white. And then they all detonate harmlessly in a wheat field half a mile from the ball-bearing factory that was supposed to be the day's prize. He is not alone in witnessing this failure. Of the 228 bombers in the formation, only 19 hit anything approaching the intended target, an 8% strike rate that, painfully, counted as a pretty good day in those brutal months, because this was the reality that the brass in Washington could recite in charts and optimistic briefings to Congress, while crews in Europe were learning an opposite truth in blood and metal, dropping unguided iron from 4 miles up while flying at 180 miles per hour under the combined assault of fighters and flak made precision essentially a mathematical fiction. In theory, the Army Air Forces had a number you could point to. Circular error probable of roughly 1,000 feet. The statistic that said if half your bombs landed within that ring, the target would be effectively neutralized. In practice, the 8th Air Force's CEP in 1943 hovered around 3,200 feet, often much worse, and the consequences were grotesquely literal. In August 1943, during the first Schweinfurt raid, 724 tons of explosives were poured onto ball-bearing factories that supplied nearly half of Germany's production. But post-strike photos showed less than 200 tons inside the factory complex. The rest had cratered neighborhoods, farms, and even a medieval church 3 miles away. While 60 bombers were lost and 600 men were killed or captured, only for those factories to be humming again within 6 weeks. Crews began to speak in a bitter shorthand. The aluminum cloud approach, tightly packed formations, the lead bombardier aiming and everyone else toggling their releases on his signal, a technique born of necessity, and blind faith that sheer volume would overcome. Inaccuracy was a kind of desperate hope that didn't take into account that German industrial plants were not vast monoliths, but compact, stubborn things. A synthetic oil plant might sit on 40 acres, easily swallowed by a bombing pattern stretched across 300 when your CEP was measured in thousands. The human cost made the calculus worse. Every mission meant 10 men. Crews flying straight into walls of black puffs of 80mm shrapnel, flak, that shredded aluminum skin like tissue paper, while inside the planes the cold could freeze blood into. Numbness and the sound of exploding fragments was described by survivors as being inside a metal drum hammered by hammers. Men catalogued holes in their ships, counted the dead in the waste, wrote in diaries that read like litany. Counted 127 holes in our ship, one navigator wrote after a mission to Bremen. Jenkins bled out in the waist before we crossed the channel. He was 19, so it was against that backdrop. Rising casualty lists, factories still turning out war materiel. A public told that precision daylight bombing would win the war, that the Norden bomb site became almost a talisman, a costly, secretive obsession. The Mark 1-15 Norden was a 50-pound mechanical analog computer, a masterpiece of pre-digital engineering that promised pickle-barrel accuracy, that used optical tracking and intricate mechanical linkages to compute wind, drift, airspeed, and trajectory, and that could, if everything behaved as the engineers assumed, actually fly the airplane through the autopilot to correct for minute errors during the bomb run. The Army Air Forces poured money into Nordens. By 1943, some $1.5 billion had been spent on development and production. An astonishing figure when you remember that the Manhattan Project cost about $2 billion, and security around the device was ferocious. Bombardiers swore oaths separate from their military oaths. Units received the sight in locked cases carried by armed guards. And in the event of a ditching, the orders were explicit. Destroy the Norden with thermite before bailing out. A souvenir not worth the cost of capture. But irony is a patient teacher. The Germans already had an inside track. Hermann Lang had acquired Norden blueprints in 1938. German engineers examined them and went on with their own designs. Yet the real problem with Norden was not that the enemy might copy its hardware, but that the site's assumptions were fantasies of laboratory conditions. Unlimited time to make a steady 3-minute level run, perfect visibility, and no defensive fire. And combat over Germany offered precisely none of those things. Targets were defended, not passive. Smoke generators could blanket an entire industrial area within minutes. And by late 1943, German doctrine mandated robust smoke defenses to rob attackers of visual references. The Norden's arithmetic broke down when you could no longer see the ground. Worse, the instrument needed steady, predictable flight to compute correctly, and steady, predictable flight is a prescription for death under concentrated anti-aircraft fire. The Germans had built, by 1943, the most sophisticated integrated anti-aircraft defense system the world had yet seen. Tens of thousands of heavy guns, overlapping batteries ringed round targets, fire control radars feeding mechanical computers that spat out firing solutions long before American crews glimpsed the target. And the 88mm, familiar to many as a tank killer, was perhaps more lethal to the bomber than to armor, capable of lofting 20-pound shells to 32,000 feet, with time-fused bursts that turned the sky into a net of supersonic fragments. To face that was to face a statistical execution. At the altitudes crews preferred in early 1943, around 18,000 feet, they flew in the optimal kill zone, where dense flak and accurate batteries could rake formations. So planners made a logical pivot: climb higher. By mid-1943, bomber formations routinely pushed to 25,000, 27,000 feet, sometimes up to 30,000, where many AA batteries were less effective and fighters had performance difficulties. But altitude brought other problems: minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, thin air, ice and oxygen deprivation for crews, and winds at altitude that were not the gentle breezes expected in classroom wind triangles, but raging jet streams of 80, 100, 120 miles per hour that could carry bombs sideways for miles. The Norden promised pickle-barrel precision at these heights, but its underlying model still assumed winds that behaved nicely along your line of flight. Over Germany, winds seldom obliged. Threads of confusion, desperation, and a single navigational mistake over Schweinfurt in October 1943 converged into an insight that changed the practice of bombing forever: the accidental discovery of offset bombing. On that catastrophic second Schweinfurt raid, 291 bombers launched, 60 shot down and 17 crippled beyond repair, a dreadful 26% loss rate. One group, the 305th, approached the IP at the wrong heading because their navigator had miscalculated a wind correction. Instead of turning the formation and inviting disaster, they committed to the approach at that oblique angle. And Captain Robert Williams told his bombardier, Lieutenant Charles Murphy, to use the Norden not to aim at the factory but to track a point offset to the right, essentially using the crosswind to walk the bombs back into the target. The strike cameras told the story. While most groups that day produced the miserable 8 to 12% hit rate common to air war over Germany. The 305th found 42% of their ordnance in the target area. At first, analysts said luck. Williams had the math to prove otherwise. The Norden had been built around an assumption that drift would be forward or backward along the track, not lateral. At high altitude, strong crosswinds created a crab angle. Aircraft needed to point into the wind to maintain course, and bombs inherited that lateral velocity. The Norden's drift computation couldn't correct for that when the site assumed the aircraft's heading was aligned with the desired ground track. Williams realized you could weaponize the crosswind. Approach at a 40 to 50 degree angle. Aim at an offset reference point, a railroad yard, a river bend, so that as the bombs fell through a minute of descent, the wind would shove them sideways from the offset point onto the actual target. The geometry tightened dispersion from a long-track smear into a predictable lateral line. And where once the Americans had carpeted the countryside, they now had a way to lay ordnance through a factory complex like threading a needle. Wind measurement became critical. Navigators refined the double drift method, taking 2 drift readings to deduce wind at altitude. And good navigators could nail winds within 5 miles per hour, a precision that suddenly made offset bombing practical. Retraining followed the discovery with the urgency of wartime necessity. Specialized schools in Florida, Arizona, and airfields across England taught crews to unlearn instincts, to stop staring at the e-talkie-fee factory, and instead learn to see the wind triangle as an offensive tool. Veteran crews returned from combat to teach novices. Instructors showed strike camera comparisons, 9% accuracy versus 38%, and the evidence was brutal and persuasive. Doctrine changed. Field Order 259 in February 1944 authorized offset approaches when crosswinds exceeded 40 miles per hour, and detailed briefings told group commanders which approach angles worked best for which targets. The northeast for Schweinfurt, 50 degrees from the west for Ruhr Valley complexes. And while some pilots resisted, clinging to tactics that had been blood-forged, the pace of implementation was relentless under leaders like General James Doolittle, who made offset training his top priority and gave officers 6 weeks to retrain crews spread across dozens of bases. By spring 1944, the system had been institutionalized. Meteorologists briefed expected winds at bombing altitudes. Navigators carried lookup tables for recalculations in flight. Lead crews mastered the technique and became the template for formations that followed. The payoff was immediate and measurable. Across the 8th Air Force in March 1944 average, CEP shrank to roughly 1,250 feet, near the planner's original 1,000-foot goal, and the percentage of bombs landing in target areas rose from 11 to 27%, a shift that turned campaigns from attritional to decisive. Offset bombing's largest test came on June 6, 1944, when the success of the entire Normandy invasion hinged on whether Allied air power could neutralize coastal batteries and bunkers that threatened thousands of landing soldiers. With only 40 minutes to blanket a string of fortifications that occupied less than 2 square miles. In twilight and cloud, traditional doctrine might have dictated failure, but offset tactics combined with radar navigational aids, H2X, Mickey radar on Pathfinder aircraft, made it possible to identify radar features as reference points and to compute offsets even when the target lay under cloud. The execution varied. At Omaha, hesitant crews added safety delays to releases, and many shells landed inland, leaving fortifications ready to break the landing. At Utah, crews trusted the math, used a 45-degree offset and crosswinds to walk bombs into emplaced batteries, knocking out 25 of 28 major fortifications and making the 4th Infantry Division's beachhead comparatively easy. The classified analysis completed in July 1944 would later show the contrast starkly. Straight-in adaptations produced 31% effectiveness at Omaha, while properly executed offset raids at Utah achieved an 89% neutralization rate, a difference measured in lives saved and in the momentum of the Allied advance. Offset bombing would spread. 9th Air Force medium bombers adopted it for tactical strikes. RAF Bomber Command, long skeptical of American daylight claims, experimented with it, and as the technique matured, it crossed into doctrine, training, and even the Cold War's strategic calculations. When the Air Force began planning nuclear delivery in the 1950s, the stakes of accuracy became existential rather than merely tactical, and offset geometry, transcoded into automated radar solutions like the AN/SCQ-38 that could identify radar reference points and compute wind drift, was folded into the new systems, the human bombardier increasingly a supervisor of machines rather than a manual calculator. But the core insight remained Williams's. Use the wind, don't fight it. The technique adapted to new domains, B-52 Arc Light missions over. Vietnam used offset runs against a swirling monsoon environment and achieved CEPs under 1,500 feet despite ferocious winds. And in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, offset thinking reappeared in doctrine for GPS-denied environments, where jamming and spoofing could render satellites useless. When guidance fails, or radiating radar would compromise stealth, crews revert to passive geometries, radar landmarks, wind triangles, and offset release points, because technology can be turned against you, and the old math is stubbornly robust. Today, even stealthy platforms and unmanned systems carry the legacy of that confused October morning over Schweinfurt. The B-2's mission planners include offset calculations as a primary option in certain denied signal scenarios, and Reaper and Predator operators sometimes use offset, aiming to put an incoming missile in the right ballpark before its guidance takes over. What began as a navigational error, one man's misread wind that forced a decision to aim at empty space and trust physics, became an urgent, pragmatic innovation that reduced collateral futility, improved survival, and, in several crucial campaigns, turned aerial bombardment from a punishment to a weapon that could be controlled and counted upon. Robert Williams and Charles Murphy probably never intended to alter the practice of warfare for 8 decades, but their accidental geometry solved a practical problem with the elegance of applied physics. Aim at the wrong place. Let the wind do the work. And sometimes the world will fall into the right order, not because machines promise it, but because human beings learn to read the invisible currents between sky and earth and to use them on purpose.